Hey, good evening. My name is Gary Mond. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. Before I introduce our guest speaker tonight, Steve McCabe, the chairman of Labour Friends of Israel, I just want to mention that this coming Sunday, we have our debate. It's on the screen now. Is there a future for Jews in the UK? We've got some 200 to 250 people registered to attend. I hope those of you who haven't yet registered will do so. It's one of the first occasions where the Jewish community has a chance to meet en masse to debate this very important topic. We don't have guest speakers. It's just your opportunity to speak. Everyone will have the opportunity to contribute if they wish to do so. So I do hope as many of you as possible will add your names to the list attending and join us on Sunday morning. My other brief announcement is please put into your diary Tuesday the 14th of May. Tuesday the 14th of May, the NJA is having a very, very major event. I won't tell you what it is in detail yet, but it's a major event. I'm sure you all know what day Tuesday the 14th of May is anyway. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Steve McCabe, the chairman of Labour Friends of Israel. Hang on a second. Yeah. Steve has served as a Labour Member of Parliament since 1997. Initially for Birmingham Hall Green and more recently for Birmingham Selly Oak. He has worked, before he was an MP in Parliament, he worked as a social worker, but most importantly of all, Steve has served for many years now as chairman of Labour Friends of Israel. What we're going to do this evening is I'm going to ask Steve a few questions and that will get the discussion going. And then after I've asked questions on the major themes, I'll give everyone else the chance to ask questions themselves. So Steve, I'd like to begin by asking you what persuaded you in the first place to become a Member of Parliament, and why are you such a strong supporter of the state of Israel?
Well, good evening. I should possibly just say at the outset that I am the chair of Labour Friends of Israel, but I am speaking in a private capacity tonight. So, you know, I don't want to suggest that anything I say is necessarily the views of the Labour Friends of Israel, the views of Steve McCabe. And I think that's probably fair just to make clear. Well, you know, why did I'm often asked that question about making the transition into politics. Actually, the people who ask it most often and who are most tenacious about it tend to be school children, actually, who are often much better interrogators than anyone else. Look, I think the answer for me is kind of simple. I was a social worker, and I actually do believe in social work, and I believe in the power of social work to help people change their behaviour and change their life and improve situations that is causing them difficulty. But if on a regular basis you're seeing people with near identical problems, then that's much more to do with social policy than it is to do with the need for individual behavioural change. And in those circumstances, I think the answer lies in politics, perhaps more than it does in social work. And I guess eventually that argument won out in me, and so I made the transition to politics. I still have a lot of interest in social work and a lot of faith in self-help organisations and in people having to do things for themselves. But I think for me, I became convinced that the bigger answers had to be at least sought in politics, if not always found. And well, I mean, in terms of Israel, you know, I think it's fairly straightforward. I would say I fundamentally believe in Israel's right to exist. I think the achievements of the Israeli people are something that I admire. A plucky little nation, I would say, who have achieved some amazing things in the face of such difficult circumstances and such adversity. Uh, and of course, Israel, as many of us believe, is not held to the same standards as other states or other nations. It's often held to very different standards. I believe that's unfair. I believe that Israel doesn't deserve any special or preferential treatment, but nor does it deserve the exact opposite, nor does it deserve to be held to standards that other nations and states aren't held to. And I think that is often the case. Birmingham, as I'm sure most of you will know, for a city its size, is a relatively small Jewish population, certainly if we compare it with, say, places like London, Manchester, or even Leeds. But we do have the largest Jewish population of students in the country, and a great many of them do actually reside in my constituency.
Thank you. Now, I want to move on now to talk about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. How did it develop? I mean, I'm old enough to remember Harold Wilson. And in my opinion, Harold Wilson was probably the most philo-Semitic prime minister this country has ever had. He was a strong supporter of Israel, particularly in its time of need. And yet, over the decades, anti-Semitism has developed. I'm not someone who thinks it's entirely due to Jeremy Corbyn. I think that's been happening. It was coming before Jeremy Corbyn became leader. So what is your feeling as to why it developed in the Labour Party? And what is your view about what Keir Starmer and the leadership are trying to do about it?
Well, I mean, I'm not convinced that there's any body, organisation or structure in this country that is necessarily entirely free from anti-Semitism, possibly not free from Islamophobia either. I mean, I think these kinds of prejudices are quite wide-based in society. And I say that as someone, who represents quite a multicultural constituency. But I think the thing that makes a difference is how much they are tolerated. If people make it clear that they won't be tolerated, if people make it clear that they're going to take a stand against it, if they make it clear that it's going to be rooted out, then it's much easier to deal with. Where people show ambivalence, indifference to it, then I think it's easier for it to grow. You're quite right. Harold Wilson was an extremely proud friend and supporter of the state of Israel, as have been most Labour leaders going back as far as at least Harold Wilson. But I think what happened during the Jeremy Corbyn era was that people on the far left who entertained quite clear anti-Semitic views felt that they were being given permission to entertain and to express and to practice those views. I think they went unchallenged. They were allowed to grow in strength to a point where they began to have an utterly pernicious impact on the workings of the party, and that I think is why the Equality and Human Rights Commission took the decisions it took. As I said a moment ago, Birmingham itself has a relatively small Jewish population for a city its size, but I was really struck during the 2019 election by the number of people who were not Jewish, who said to me, "How on earth did you let this happen?" And I think, in terms of Keir Starmer, my view is simple. Keir recognises that we can't afford to ever let such views take any kind of hold in our party ever again. And I trust and believe him when he makes it clear that his intention is to root it out. As I say, my own view is that there are many parties and organisations and structures in our society where such views do exist. But the thing that is important is that they are not given any encouragement to exist, and where they are identified, they are dealt with.
Thank you. I think this is a vitally important area, because it's not whether we vote Labour or we vote Conservative or whatever our political attitudes are, nobody wants to see anti-Semitism develop in a major political party. And one of the fears that many in the Jewish community, I believe, have is we're looking at the forthcoming general election. Labour currently have around 200 members of parliament. If opinion polls are to be believed, they might have about 400 members of parliament after the next election, doubling the number. Now, how well vetted are all these prospective parliamentary candidates who are not yet MPs, who will become MPs after the election or may become MPs? Because while the spotlight is pretty well on the current Labour MPs, there's so many potential MPs we simply don't know anything about. And do you think that there are other steps? Has it ever occurred to you that there might be other steps that Labour could take to help to further eradicate the problem?
Well, I'm always interested to hear people who have got practical suggestions to make things better. Look, I can't say hand on heart that every single candidate standing for the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or indeed a number of other parties has been entirely and adequately vetted. It's a fine line in a democratic society between reasonable vetting and unreasonable intrusion into an individual's life. So I can't say that hand on heart. I believe that the vetting process in the Labour Party is designed to prevent people who entertain racist views from having any place in the party. And I would hope, and I don't say this as a snide remark, I would hope that the same is true in the Conservative Party. And as I said earlier, that for me applies to Islamophobia as much as it does to anti-Semitism. But I come back to the point that where people, I take the view that everybody is entitled to a mistake. These things happen, we're all human, and where someone makes a genuine error and is willing to own up and apologise and do what they can to put it right. I myself, maybe it's just as well I don't make these decisions, but I myself am not interested in hounding such a person. But I think you're entitled to one mistake. I don't think you're entitled to repeated mistakes. And I think repeated behaviour is not a mistake, it's a deliberate activity. And I think where people are trying to disguise their racist views but still carry on in a mainstream party, then the obligation is on the party leadership to make sure that they are kicked out.
Understood. Just moving on now, before I move on to my next question, I just want to say to everybody, if you want to ask questions, please can you put up your virtual hand? You'll see it at the bottom of your screen, there's a hand that says raise hand. So please can you start raising your hands? I've got two more questions before I call on anyone else. First of my remaining two questions relates to the war. How is, on the backbenches of the Labour Party, how are we starting to see attitudes for? I know there are many Labour MPs who are calling for an immediate ceasefire. How do you see Labour policy developing in that regard? And what other attitudes do you see coming from Labour MPs to Israel and the war in general at the moment?
Well, I mean, look, I can't believe anybody isn't horrified by the length of time the war has gone on already, and I can't believe anyone is horrified by the civilian casualties we are seeing on the Palestinian side. I think you'd be a very strange person if you were not moved by that. But I mean, what we have to keep in perspective is that this is a war that started because of the attack on Israel on October the 7th. This is a war that was almost certainly orchestrated by the theocracy in Iran. This is a war where rape and the ugliest kinds of violence were considered part of the attack on Israel to be not only celebrated but broadcast by the perpetrators wearing GoPro cameras to highlight the ugliness of their behavior. So everybody that whose opinion I value and listen to in the Labour Party, everyone I know wants a ceasefire. I don't know anyone who, apart from perhaps the leaders of Hamas or the people in Tehran. I can't imagine too many people don't want a ceasefire. But the reality is, a ceasefire can only occur if both sides are going to cooperate with a ceasefire. I think it would be impossible for the Israeli government. I don't have any particular vested interest in supporting or defending the Israeli government, but I think it would be impossible for the Israeli government to agree a ceasefire that didn't guarantee the release of the hostages. I think that is broadly a position that's adopted by most Western governments, and it's the position of the UK government and the position of the UK Labour Party. Of course, there will be voices who take a more strident line. There will be voices which are much more hostile to Israel. As I said before, there is always a danger that Israel is held to a higher standard than other states of nations, and that's something we should argue against and point out and seek balance on when there are debates. I think that's always a risk, but the reality is that there will be no ceasefire unless the hostages are released. There will be no ceasefire unless there is an agreement between both sides that they abide with. And a ceasefire in itself, unless there are more constructive steps to a longer lasting peace, is of limited value. And there will be absolutely no ceasefire as a result of people marching in the streets of the UK and chanting ceasefire now, because that is not really, in my view, recognising the reality of the situation. In some cases, that's the actions of people who really mean they want Israel to surrender now. And in other cases, it's the actions of people who misunderstand the complexity of the situation that we're all dealing with.
Thank you very much. My final question before I throw it open to everyone else is one of the long-term policies of Labour, and indeed of most major political parties in the democratic world, is to support a two-state solution, ultimately. I think that has taken a step back, shall we say, because of the war. How do you see it potentially developing? Many people today just cannot see it coming to pass at all. How do you think it could possibly come about, if at all?
Oh, I mean, these are my views, as I said at the beginning. So,
Sorry, you've gone on mute, Steve. We can't hear you. Steve, you're on mute. Oh,
I don't know what caused that. Nothing to do with
okay,
me.
you start your answer again, please. Yeah.
Must be a gremlin after me. No, as I said earlier, these are my views. I don't attribute them to anyone else. But my view is the only long-term solution, the only chance of viable peace is for a viable and democratic Palestinian state alongside a recognized Israel. And I ultimately think that has to be the case. And although I don't want to make too close a parallel, I do recall in my early days as an MP the work on the Northern Ireland arrangements and the people who said at that time that it wouldn't be possible to get peace. I actually believe there's a constituency for peace, both amongst the Israeli people and amongst the Palestinian people that I have met. I think it is difficult, and it would be very strange if the war did make it more difficult. Although, interestingly enough, the Oslo Accords did come out of the initial intifadas. So, there is a parallel previously for how terrible things can lead to better steps, even if people subsequently set out to wreck the Oslo Accords. The steps, well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the existing political administration in Israel is not committed to a two-state solution. I don't know what would happen if there were an election. It's hard to see an election in the middle of a war. If there were an election in Israel, I wonder if we might see a more balanced government in the future. That tends to be my view. The steps to a two-state solution, it seems to me, would have to be that the Hamas leadership would need to be removed one way or another from Gaza. There would need to be a new civilian administration. I believe that would need to be supported by some kind of international, preferably Arab-led force to give it a chance. I think we would want to see an eventual reunification of Gaza and the West Bank under a viable civilian administration. And I don't underestimate any of these tasks. I appreciate they are all difficult, but they are the steps that I believe would need to be taken. I believe there are people, surprisingly a very large number of younger people on both sides of the divide, who would want and welcome such things. And I'm old enough to remember the Berlin Wall coming down and Nelson Mandela leaving prison and ending up the president of South Africa. So I remain a bit of an optimist. That's possibly why I survive in politics.
Thank you very much. Right, now I'm going to open it to questions. Can I please ask people to ask questions and not make speeches, so we have time for as many questions as possible? Jeremy Brown first, followed by Dr. Irene Lancaster, followed by Carl Cohen. So Jeremy, off you go.
Hi there. Good to listen to you, Steve. You made a point, obviously, about peace. It would be great to see peace, but I think, first of all, Fatah need to stop their pay for slay, which is where somebody who kills Israelis gets a pension. But the question I was going to ask was, Keir Starmer, he's taking a strong stand against anti-Semitism, but how can the Metropolitan Police and the BBC show that Jews in the future in the UK are safe?
Right. Well, just on your first point, I absolutely agree that one of the things that has to be tackled are the in the aid that is given to the Palestinians and to the Palestinian Authority. We need to tackle this issue of what's in the textbooks, and we need to tackle this question of paying for the paying the families of terrorists. So I think that's what you're referring to as pay for slay. I think we would agree on that. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Just remind me of your question.
So the Metropolitan Police,
yeah, the Metropolitan Police,
even
the
this
BBC.
weekend,
Sorry,
even
sorry,
this weekend, there was an Iranian guy.
Yeah,
who held
yes, I did see I saw the bit of film on it. Well, look, I mean, I was asked this. I was doing a thing on Saturday in Birmingham, and I was asked this question, or a very similar question. Look, I am a bit weary of introducing laws in response to some of the situations we're witnessing right this minute, because I think in a democracy that's based around individual and personal freedoms, we should be a bit wary of just jumping to change laws to deal with immediate situations. I don't approve of protests that are deliberately going past synagogues and Jewish schools, and I think we all know that some of the behaviour of these so-called, peaceful demonstrations is deliberately quite intimidatory and offensive. So I don't really approve of that. It's my view that British policing has a phenomenal amount of discretion attached to it. It's one of the ways that we have been able to survive no end of social events and turmoil over the years. And I personally think the balance of the policing is wrong at the moment. I think it is putting too much effort into allowing, things like the slogan being shown on the House of Commons, or the chants of "from the river to the sea," or the example you quote of the guy, what the rationale was. I'd like to hear it for arresting the guy on Saturday who was protesting the Iranians. I think the discretion's in the wrong place, and I would like to see it a bit better. Now, I've already been criticised for saying things about the BBC. I suppose it's quite difficult for the BBC. You either love the BBC or you hate it, or in some people's circumstances, they love it when it's saying things they agree with, and they hate it when it's saying things or not. I don't think the BBC coverage of this has been good enough, or is up to the standards of balance that we might reasonably expect. I think they probably are under a great deal of pressure, and I think it's very easy to see something that you disapprove of and say, "Oh, see, there you are, that's them." But I hope that the BBC will, after this is over, take a long, hard look at their coverage. I mean, I think one of the early episodes that stuck out for me was the hospital situation where the IDF were accused, only for it later to emerge that it was a misfiring terrorist missile. I think the BBC reporting of that was outrageous. And I think there are other examples. But I mean, I'm very conscious, as I say, it is difficult because there are so many people who, when they see something they approve of, it's fine. It's a bit like the average Daily Mail reader who says, "Oh, tut, tut, I don't read the Daily Mail, I don't like those views." And then they come across something that they do want to believe, and they say, "Oh, well, there must be something in it." I think it's a bit the same sort of thing. I think the best we could hope for with the BBC is that there will be a proper look at their coverage of this with an attempt to learn lessons in the future. And with the police, I'd like to see them use some of that discretion, which they're entitled to use, to try and dial down some of the more offensive behaviour that I think has been allowed in some of the demonstrations.
Thank you, Steve. Can I just say, if you don't read the news, you're uninformed, but often when you read it, you're misinformed.
It's a great way of putting it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Dr. Irene Lancaster, following her Carl Cohen, and following him David Lazarus. Dr. Lancaster, please can you turn your camera on?
Yes, I've turned it on, actually. I have turned it on. I better go into the light.
Oh dear. Oh yeah,
Yes,
you're becoming lighter every second.
Right, good. Hello. Thanks,
Great.
Steve. Thanks for coming on. Steve, I have actually voted Labour for my MP in Manchester, adjacent to Rochdale, near Prestwich, Graham Stringer, for the last few years. I never did that before, but I thought he got it about Jews in Israel, and he's been very brave like you. How can you account for the fact that the former mayor of Greater Manchester, who was a Muslim, the first Muslim, he was feted by our community. I personally taught his kids for 2 years. I tutored them. They got marvellous results. The police said I shouldn't go anywhere near the neighbourhood. And then when he becomes an MP, like so many others from that background who are Labour, he starts saying that we are genocidal. I heard him in Parliament. He's not my MP. I mean, that is Graham. My brother lives in Rochdale. I warned the official Jewish community 25 years ago about Rochdale because I could see what was going on in schools. I don't think we have the right to criticise Israel, where I just visited a week ago and met lots of lovely Arabs in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, who were in all sorts of jobs, and some of them were leading jobs. And I've written about it for the website I write for. What I want to ask you is, we are very scared in this part of Greater Manchester about Rochdale. Forget about Galloway at the moment. It was the Labour MP. How can the Labour Party, which is supposed to have, conquered all these this anti-Semitism? I have met Keir Starmer. He was very nice as DPP. Please, could you explain how he and so many other people in Rochdale and other places have been taken on by your party and are allowed to get away with what they're saying in Parliament? As I said, I'm not blaming you for Galloway, but, the Labour guy was just as bad. Sorry if that seemed a bit long. I'm very grateful that you've come here, by the way, to this forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of people, a lot of Jewish people who are frightened. I don't think they're kidding on, and I think the latest CST report is pretty clear about the rise in threats and violence to the Jewish population in this country. So, I just think that's a given from my point of view, and I would certainly know that would be Graham's, or I would anticipate that would be Graham's view as well. But what I can say about Rochdale is that I think I am one of a great many people who was genuinely surprised by the turn of events in Rochdale. I think we have to accept that we have to learn some pretty important lessons from that, and that does relate to our vetting procedures, which came up earlier. It's for the sake of it, I don't think Galloway would have won if there had been a proper Labour campaign. So, and I've seen his tactics elsewhere, including in Batley not that long ago. So, nothing of that surprises me. I don't think there is any reason, this goes to the nub of the question about anti-Semitism, it seems to me. People are entitled to criticise the actions of the IDF. They're entitled to criticise the actions of the Israeli government. I would certainly never want to be an apologist who didn't feel capable of saying when I objected to something associated with Israel. And I like to think I have quite a good relationship with the Israeli ambassador at the moment, but she would, I think, tell you that we've had our disagreements on things. It's not, that's no secret. I don't think that's a position I want us to be in. The test should be Are you criticizing Israel's right to exist? Are you displaying an anti-Semitic view of the situation? Are you really holding Jews everywhere accountable for the actions of the Israeli government? Are you deliberately trying to write out of history facts that contradict the arguments that you are making? It seems to me those are the kind of tests that should be applied. And, you know, what I see in the Parliamentary Labour Party at the moment is there's been quite a number of examples of people who are currently suspended, people who've had the whip withdrawn, people who may well not be allowed, well, if the whip remains withdrawn, will not be allowed to stand as Labour candidates at the next general election. So, I mean, my sense is that Keir Starmer is living up to what he promised us on that. But, you know, as I said right at the outset, I'm not trying to say it's perfect, and I'm not trying to say that there will not be people who will try to embed themselves in organisations which don't share their views and surreptitiously still try to practice them. I think we see that in political parties, we see it in public organisations, and you know, the test must be whether or not we take action against these people as they are revealed, and that's what I will argue for, and that's what I hope we will do.
Thank you very much, Steve. The next question will be Carl Cohen, then I will call David Lazarus and then Benjamin Tamba. Please get your questions in. Right, Carl, over to you.
Yes, thank you for honoring us with your presence and your long-held support for Israel and the Jewish people. It's much appreciated. I gained some kind of notoriety on this forum for being almost unable to ask questions, but I will make only, I'm sorry, I'll make only a short statement that is essential. It is very, it's a statement of fact. British Jewry feel that it has been forsaken. There is no place, there is no future for British Jews. Let's leave out all the platitudes and the useless assurances we receive from all quarters. There is something else, a plea from the heart. Please, to all people of goodwill and well-meaning people, do not preach morality to the Israeli army, the most humane army in the world. I served in it. Do not preach morality to the Israeli people and the Israeli nation that gave the world its moral code. It's very hard to swallow. And leave it to the Israelis. Do not, and again, when I hear the meaningless assurances that we all agree, we accept Israel's right to exist and to defend itself. Way, unbelievable. How generous. What other nation has to obtain this great generosity? Israel exists in spite of what the world thinks or wants to do to it. So just, if we could only, something else, how will a future Labour government or the current political system, how are you all people dealing with the blasphemy law, which is actually in action, more or less, and only it applies to only one religion, and that's the religion of peace? How are you dealing with the so-called police in this country? It's not a force anymore, it's not a service. The police that has become accomplice.
I think there's several questions there, Carl.
Yes, accomplice and an enabler to the violence against Jews on the streets of Britain.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carl. I think that's quite a lot for Steve to get his teeth into. Steve.
Well, I can only repeat, I hear your anger about some of the things that are going on, but I can only repeat what I've said earlier. My own view is that it's wrong for people to try and hold Israel to higher standards than any other nation or state, and that is in itself an example of anti-Semitism at work. But that doesn't mean that Israel can be utterly immune from criticism, and that's not a position I advance.
That's not what I said. I never mentioned that. I only mentioned that Israel should not be preached about morality.
Okay, Carl, let Steve carry on, please.
Well, as I was saying, that's not my position. I regard myself as a friend of Israel, the state of Israel, and the Israeli people. But friends can be critical too, and that happens sometimes. So I would rather not go down that route. In terms of the long term, I mean, I've said earlier where I hope we can end up someday, but in the short run, a Labour government would have no lesser relationship with the Israeli government and the state of Israel than the present government in the UK. We'd be committed to the same bilateral relationship. We'd be committed to the same desire for a good trade deal, and we want to share the things that we already share, from which we both benefit. In terms of the police, again, I actually think the police are being asked to do quite a difficult job at the moment. So I'm a bit loath to go overboard, but I did say that my own view is that I thought the way they were using their discretion had tipped a balance in the wrong direction, and I would like to see a reappraisal of that. That is my view. I don't know that they are trying to pick sides. I think they are making decisions that perhaps need to be looked at again. And I think it is extremely difficult. You have to remember these demonstrations are broadly, as I see it, and I'm speaking for myself here, they're broadly composed of four elements. They are composed of an organizational structure, the old hard left, who basically don't agree with democratic politics, full stop. Palestinian organizations that are extremely supportive of Hamas, young Muslims who I believe are not well informed and where we must be fearful of a risk of radicalization, and quite a lot of British, otherwise fair, liberal-minded people who are being taken in by the demonstrations because they are distressed at the casualties they're seeing in Gaza. They are a difficult thing to police. I would like the police to use their discretion more to ensure that those who are out to intimidate and to cause offence are penalised for it.
Thank you very much. David Lazarus, followed by Benjamin Tamba, and I haven't got questions beyond after Benjamin, so if you want to ask questions, please put your hand up. David.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Why would David Lammy make a good foreign secretary? Why does step one? Question number two, I never hear David Lammy speak about what the Palestinians must do and how terrible things have happened within the government on the West Bank and the Palestinians, but I hear a lot about him talking about what Israel must do. Well, am I right or am I wrong? Thank you.
Well, if you'd been at the LFI lunch earlier this year, I think you would have heard David quite clearly say some of the things that we have to expect of the Palestinians. It may be, and again, this is my view, I'm not trying to put words in anyone's mouth. It may be that in the case of Israel, we are dealing with a legitimate democratic government, and so we are having, the equivalent of normal political dialogue, which sometimes is quite frank and quite robust. That's not that unusual. In the case of Gaza, we are talking about a terrorist group, and we're not speaking to them directly. We're speaking through intermediaries, and we are dealing with it in a very different way, it would seem to me. David Lammy himself is a long-standing member of Labour Friends of Israel. I've had quite a number of conversations with David over the years. I personally don't doubt his commitment to the state of Israel, and I think he's a pretty genuine, decent, fair-minded guy who would make a pretty good foreign secretary, and I hope I'll get the chance to see him do it.
Thank you, Steve. Benjamin, and then Tim Friedman after Benjamin. Benjamin.
Hello, thank you very much for. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
On behalf of in support for IDF and the Bring Them Home campaign, let me make one thing clear. The IDF are not coming back home until all hostages are released and Hamas has surrendered. That is the duty of a defensive state. They are soldiers who go to have sworn an oath to defend their country, and that's their duty to do that. Netanyahu has formed a unity government with one objective. They have to come back home when the terrorists that came to kidnap their babies have given up their babies back to them, and they are all back home. That's a fact. We can't create a political careers about it from both parties. One thing I want to make it clear: Rishi Sunak can say that if you like what Hamas did in October 7th, don't vote for me. He can say that. If Keir Starmer says that he will lose vote, that's a fact. So can the Labour Party stop playing around with anti-Semitism? It's been throughout their history. We can't cover this up. If Rishi Sunak say right now, I bet you Rishi Sunak can say, you know what? If you believe October 7 was right, if you believe Hamas still have the right to keep these hostages, don't vote for me. He will still gain more vote. I'm telling you, if he says that, he will still gain more vote. If Keir Starmer says that, he will lose vote. That's a fact. So it's time for Keir Starmer to let the British public know that anti-Semitism is not creating political excuse. It's about telling his voters that, look, tell Hamas to give up the hostages so that IDF will go back home, because that's why they are in Gaza. They are not in Gaza because they hate Palestinians. They are in Gaza because they want their families back. Every day they get phone calls from family members. Can Labour Party say that publicly? Because it will help. It will end the war. It will help the release of the hostages.
Benjamin, I think that's clear. Steve.
Well, I think I did say right at the outset that it's my view that there will be no ceasefire, no peace until there is agreement to release the hostages. So I don't think there is, we may use slightly different words to describe it. I don't think there's a great deal of difference in our view on that. The hostages, those that are still alive, have got to be released.
They better be.
Have got to be
we hope so.
released. So I don't think there's much difference on that. I think, if you will allow me, I think you're painting a slightly binary picture of the relationship in British politics at the moment, because I'm not sure that the current Conservative Party is a totally homogeneous group and that everyone is saying the same thing. And I think, there's quite a lot of evidence in the media that isn't the case at the moment. So I'm not sure I would paint it in quite the way you have. And equally, I think there's probably about 6,000 or 7,000 Muslim voters in my own constituency. I think the idea that Muslim voters are some kind of homogeneous lump who all act and think the same way, it's just ridiculous. And certainly when I talk to people, of course people are concerned. People of all religions and none are concerned about what's happening in Gaza, just as they are about what's happened and is still happening in terms of the consequence in Israel. But people are also concerned about all sorts of other basic things, you know, their standard of living, how safe it is for their children to go to school, how safe it is for their daughters to walk home, how if they're going to keep their job and be able to pay their mortgage. I don't really buy this argument that in a general election, people, you know, this is the kind of Galloway argument. I don't buy the argument that in a general election, people, however much with the best of intentions, they're concerned about events in Gaza. I don't believe that the primary influence in a general election will be a war that's happening 2,500 miles away. I just don't get that. I think that
it's looking like that, though.
I think, well, it's looking like that with respect to you, Benjamin. It's not looking like that to me. I think that what we have to try and do, those of us who actually don't want to see a race war in this country.
George Galloway didn't win the election because he's some intelligent guy that can fix his community.
Sorry,
he won
Benjamin,
election.
let's
I'm just trying to make a point. Sorry about that, sir. We just look, politicians and bureaucrats mess around with facts. Facts are facts. George Galloway didn't win the election because he was some smart guy that are going to fix grooming gangs or drug pandemics or homelessness in his community. He won the election based on the fact that he's talking about Gaza, and his point he's making in the parliament on his speech that he was sworn in was this. He said the next election is going to be about religion. I'm not even talking about religion. There are Muslim IDF soldiers in Gaza. This is what we're not talking about. There are Muslim Israeli soldiers in Gaza fighting to release the hostages. So it's not about religion. Can the Labour Party admit the fact that if they say that don't vote for me if you support October 11, if you support not to release the hostages, they will lose vote? And the answer is yes. You can't hide anti-Semitism. You can't downplay that.
Please, you've made your point, Benjamin. Please, can you now let Steve finish?
Well, as I say, as I pointed out earlier, I mean, George Galloway won an election in very special circumstances with less than 40% of the vote and no formal opposition to him. So I wouldn't actually be broadcasting, as you have just been, what George Galloway claims. I don't really believe that is the case at all. But I do think those of us who regard ourselves as responsible politicians and those of us who regard ourselves as wanting to be responsible on issues like this must try to avoid talking the language of race wars. I don't want to see British people, whether they be Jews, Muslims, Christians, or of no religion at all, I don't want to see them set against each other. I believe the people who have a vested interest in doing that are people who have no respect for democratic tradition. I think they are wrong. And I think that what we have to do is not allow the events in Gaza, however difficult they are at the moment, to poison and contaminate our communities, because I don't think that is in any of our interests.
Okay, Tim Friedman is next, then Deborah Wald.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you. What I wanted to ask was in relation to the police. Clearly, in the demonstrations that we've seen, the so-called pro-Palestinian protests, there are a number of individuals. We don't know whether it's 1%, 10%, 20%, we don't know what the proportion is, but there's certainly a lot of people who are expressing anti-Semitic as opposed to anti-Israel views. If all of these were taken out by the police, as many of us feel in some way they should be, what does the police do about them? They can't lock them all up. They can't send them to prison. What on earth can they do with them if they do find them guilty of anti-Semitism? There's just too many to deal with them in the normal course of events.
Steve.
Well, look, one of the reasons why I said earlier that, you know, I think the police have got a difficult job, and I'm a bit loath to be unduly critical, is, of course, I've seen the other side of this as well. I've seen someone like me trying to hold my advice centres and protesters gathering outside the church or the community centre where I hold them, and, you know, making it difficult for ordinary constituents to access my advice centre to see their local MP, often about things of a very sensitive and personal nature for them. I've seen the police taking off other duties on a Saturday morning and having to link arms to enable me to safely enter and leave my own advice centre. And I know that they do that because they are trying to uphold the rights of people in this country to go about their normal business, and the rights of people to have legitimate demonstrations and protests. The test is where they go overboard. Now, I happen to agree with you. I think there are lots of people in these mass demonstrations who are almost certainly going way beyond the bounds of what we would call legitimate protest. You ask what we should do about them, because, you know, I'm not sure, other than the pressure on the courts to get any offenders through the justice system at the present time, but I'm not sure they couldn't be fined. I mean, we do have provision for on-the-spot fines in this country. That would be one solution if you didn't want to entirely glue up the judicial system, as I say, at a time when there's enormous pressure on the courts. We do have provision for on-the-spot fines. It may be that that the police should revisit that, and maybe it would be useful for the Justice Secretary to have some discussions on that approach.
Thank you, Steve. Deborah Wald.
Good evening. Thank you, Steve, for your very interesting comments. I've got several prongs to my question, which is, firstly, how do you dial down the incendiary way the words anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are being used, because they're being tossed about without due care and attention? Anti-Semitism is somewhat different than Islamophobia. They do have different aspects to them. How do you get to be heard when there is this incendiary aspect of kind of reactivity, when even organs that should want to hear all sides, such as the BBC, don't seem to want to have the balance? They don't seem to be asking. They shut down the Jewish lawyers for Israel just when the bomb was going into Al-Shifa. So, you know, they don't want that opinion. So where do you find a space that you can get information out to people who aren't us, who are not preaching to the choir? Because it just seems we're in a very selective cancel culture at the moment. It's like gender critical, only it's race critical.
Steve.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are not identical, but I think they both have very common properties of hatred attached to them, and hatred of someone because of who they are. And you know,
but they're not an equation of one going one way to the other and one going one way to the other. You know, there's a triangle here, not just a single line going backwards and forwards. And that is never pointed out in the media.
Well, I would set some of what you say, but I would simply make the point that I think if you're on the receiving end, it's pretty much the same to a large extent. And it is interesting that an organisation like CST is able to work with and cooperate with Tell Mama. So, you know, there is evidence that sensible, rational people who want to do the right thing are capable of doing it. I think
Not the
one
PSC, though. Not the
Uh,
PSC. Ben Jamal has rewritten what from the river to the sea means in the past 5 months.
so I believe, yes. Sorry, I'm not laughing at it, but you know, of course, you're going to get that sort of nonsense all the time. What I think is the problem really for a lot of news outlets at the moment is that they should do a lot more to check the authenticity and the background of their talking heads. There are too many people who are allowed to pop up as a voice who's concerned about this or that, who, were they to look at them in a bit more detail, is little more than a spokesman or a spokeswoman for a specific set of views and often organisations. And I think, you know, we're losing the kind of balance that you would expect our media to provide. Some of our media is quite clear it's not even attempting to produce balance, but I mean, normally you would expect that of the BBC. I think they're losing it because I think the pressures of 24-hour media sometimes mean that they're too quick to accept for interview talking heads who are not people who are going to actually be much other than propagandists.
Could you speak out and ask why BBC Verify is only verifying Hamas? End of things. I'm tweeting more or less to try
They don't
and
even talk about the
assess
hostages.
the numbers.
They don't even talk about the hostages.
Sorry,
They don't mention their names.
Thank
It's a
you.
fact.
I mean, to be honest, I have been critical, and I am critical at times of the BBC. I don't honestly know that it is the case that they are only presenting the Hamas side of things. I do understand when you're witnessing something that you know or are fairly confident is absolutely wrong, and you're sitting there in your sitting room listening to it, you think, oh my God, what is happening here? But I'm not sure that that is my view. And as I said earlier, I hope, excuse me, I hope at the end of this, the BBC will take a long, hard look at the lessons to be learned from this kind of coverage.
I'm going to ask the next question there is talk of a future Labour government bringing in a formal definition of Islamophobia. And this is something I know that worries a lot of people in the Jewish community. You see, many of us believe that the opposite of anti-Semitism is not Islamophobia, it's anti-Muslim hatred. And many of us believe anti-Muslim hatred is every bit as serious and horrendous as anti-Semitism. Islamophobia is widely regarded as something a bit different. It's more concerned about principles, religious principles. And essentially, a definition might try to stop people criticizing a religion.
Yeah.
And the issue, and that is, I think, the concern. For example, Jews do not get attacked because we don't believe Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Yeah. Nobody would, and also those who don't agree with our Torah concerning homosexuality also don't get attacked. So there is a concern that Islam is being singled out here. I want to know if you have any thoughts as to whether a Labour government is going to bring in a definition of Islamophobia and what your own thoughts are about it. I realise you're only speaking for yourself here.
Well, I don't know if I'm not aware that Labour has any plans to do that. I genuinely am not aware, and I hope you'll forgive me. But I mean, I'm not the best person to enter into a kind of pseudo-theological debate with you. I don't really think I'm equipped to handle it. When I talk about this, I'm saying that the people who are on the receiving end are broadly receiving the same stuff. They're receiving threats, abuse, intimidation, and they're receiving it because of who they are. They're receiving it because they're Jews, or they're receiving it because they're Muslims. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what I'm saying is wrong.
Okay, right. Well, any other, I think as we're 8 minutes past 8, I just want to bring matters now to a close, and I want to thank Steve very much. I'm going to call on Keith Rowe in a moment to propose a formal vote of thanks. First, I just want to remind everybody again that this coming Sunday, we have our discussion about whether there is a future for the Jewish community in this country. I think we're the first assembly group of any nature to have such a discussion. We have several hundred people registered. I hope as many of you will come as possible. And I've just been reading in the chat, quite a few people have been talking in the chat about the future for the community in this country. So now can I ask Keith Rowe? Keith is our vice chairman, and he was also former president of the Birmingham Hebrew congregation. Keith, would you like to propose a vote of thanks?
Certainly. Thank you, Gary. Hello, Steve. Just to prove that we're a national organisation, it falls on a fellow Brummie to give you the thanks. It's good to see you again.
You too.
We've heard quite a lot from you this evening of your journey from social work into politics and the reasons why you got into politics. I think you're perhaps one of the rarity these days in that I would consider you a conviction politician. You know what you want to do and you're not in it for your own purposes, unlike a lot of people, I think, in the current House of Commons. Throughout the Corbyn years, you've been a great supporter of the State of Israel, and I think we should all thank you for your support and for everything that you do in that regard. We've come across each other a number of times in various different forums and chaired different things, and you've spoken at vigils and things where your support has been appreciated. But I don't think at any of those have you faced tougher questioning than you've had this evening. You've had some very honest, straightforward questions, which you've managed to answer in a very honest manner, which has really made us feel that you understand the situation and that you've, as I say, covered things in a very straightforward way. I can only hope that the next cohort of politicians that come into the House of Commons after the next general election will be in your mould and will deal with matters in the same way that you do and that you have. So I do hope that you will keep in touch with the NJA. Hopefully you'll come back to speak to us again as things develop and as things progress in the future. And I would like to thank you again for your time this evening and again for everything that you do on behalf of supporting Israel in the Labour Party.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending tonight.